the Navigational Horizon 2025 to 2035. Section 1. Executive Synthesis. On. The Navigational Stance. This document is prepared for operators, not visionaries. It does not offer a catalogue of speculative solutions or a program for idealized reform. It establishes a navigational stance for a decade in which structural constraints outweigh discretionary choice. Between 2025 and 2035, the operating environment for institutions will be defined by constrained friction, a condition in which growth remains possible, but only through continuous adaptation to forces that cannot be resolved, only managed. The prior era of solutionism, where policy interventions aim to eliminate categories of risk, has been displaced by an era of navigation. Forward motion now requires persistent maneuvers through dilemmas that refuse to be transcended. This shift is not a temporary disruption. It is a permanent reconfiguration of the operational field. The global architecture constructed between 1990 and 2020 was predicated on the assumption that friction could be engineered out, that supply chains could be optimized for cost rather than resilience, and that capital could flow without security friction. That architecture is now unwinding. Strategic posture must shift to what military planners term maneuver warfare. The capacity to identify transient opportunities, commit resources with the awareness that context will shift, and reposition without institutional trauma when it does. This synthesis establishes the map. It describes three interlocking layers of constraint: geopolitical, institutional, and individual, and identifies the vectors of transformation that will determine which entities retain adaptive capacity. 2. The triangulated map. 3 layers of constraint. The operating environment is structured by 3 mutually reinforcing constraints, each operating at a different scale but locked in a feedback dynamic. The macro constraint: fragmented friction. The dominant reality of the coming decade is the shift from efficiency-led globalization to security-weighted regionalism. Trade, capital, and technology flows are being rerouted to minimize exposure to strategic rivals rather than to minimize cost. Regulatory architectures that once aimed for interoperability are being rewritten to embed exclusion as a design feature. This is not a total decoupling, but a decisive departure from borderless optimization. Firms and governments now navigate partially overlapping systems, a Western-aligned network, an Eastern-anchored block, and a contested middle extracting advantage from both. The friction is now structural. The meso-constraint: institutional hardening. At the institutional layer, the defining reality is fiscal fatigue. Governments confront debt servicing costs that compete directly with policy ambitions. The simultaneous demands of decarbonization, demographic aging, and defense recapitalization cannot be met within existing fiscal envelopes. Governments resort to regulatory whiplash, substituting rulemaking for funding. Compliance requirements multiply and standards are raised as a substitute for expenditure, creating an environment where firms face high fixed costs and low predictability. The state is more present in decision-making, but less capable of absorbing systemic risk. The micro-constraint: the responsiveness gap. At the individual and firm level, constraint manifests as a widening disjunction between contribution and return. Public services become slower and more rationed, while attention and tax demands increase. The adaptive response is parallel governance, the construction of private resilience stacks. Individuals and organizations bypass failing public institutions for private healthcare, security, and digital networks. This is not ideological withdrawal, but pragmatic substitution. It hollows out the public realm, reducing the constituency with a stake in public performance and accelerating relative decline. 3. The three vectors of transformation. Three forces determine institutional viability across the next decade, defining where capacity is gained and where it is lost. Vector A. The return and limit of the state. The state reasserts itself in industrial policy and supply chain oversight, while simultaneously confronting the edge of its administrative capacity. Entities must align with state priorities to secure access to public capital while maintaining the flexibility to survive state volatility. Vector B. The productivity siege. Demographic trends remove labor force growth as a source of expansion. Productivity growth becomes the sole driver of GDP. Technology adoption, specifically automation and machine intelligence, shifts from a competitive advantage to a survival requirement. The constraint is whether adoption can outpace demographic drag. Vector C. The resilience premium. The logic of just-in-time efficiency has become a liability. Markets are beginning to price in resilience. Redundancy, diversification, and slack are now recognized as insurance against frequent systemic shocks. The ability to absorb disruption without breaking is the primary metric of operational success. 4. The orientation. Decision under constraint. Success in 2035 is not defined by the resolution of systemic challenges. Climate risk, inequality, and geopolitical tension remain persistent features of the landscape. The differentiator is adaptive capacity, the organizational ability to detect shifts early, reallocate resources without paralysis, and exit failing positions before damage becomes irreversible. Adaptive capacity is an active capability. It requires financial and organizational slack sufficient to fund repositioning without external approval. It demands leadership. Cultures that operate without the expectation of stable forecasts. Entities that plan for environmental stabilization expose themselves to cumulative risk. Precision forecasting and rigid efficiency have become liabilities. For the operator, the task is not to predict the outcome of the friction, but to maintain a decision posture that remains viable regardless of it. Navigation, not optimization, is the core competence. This paper is the map. The responsibility for movement remains with the reader. Section 2. The Geopolitical and Governance Substrate. 1. The death of the neutral market. For 3 decades, global commerce was organized around a premise that is no longer operative, that markets could function as neutral spaces, transactions occurring without reference to the political identity of the participants. Trade flows were determined by comparative advantage. Capital moved towards return. The nationality of the buyer and the alliance structure of the government were treated as externalities. That architecture has not merely been strained, it has collapsed. Markets are now explicitly securitized arenas. Economic exchange is conditioned by alliance structure, strategic exposure, and regime compatibility. This shift reflects a structural reordering of how states perceive vulnerability. The lesson absorbed by all major powers is that dependence without control constitutes an existential risk. The market is no longer trusted to distribute capacity safely. It is managed as a terrain of exposure. The operational outcome is securitized trade. Goods, capital, data, and knowledge flows are filtered through security frameworks before price is considered. Export control regimes extend beyond military hardware into semiconductors, energy systems, and biotechnologies. Investment screening scrutinizes ultimate beneficiaries. Procurement standards incorporate origin and political reliability alongside cost. Efficiency has not disappeared as a variable, it has been subordinated. International Monetary Fund analysis from 2025 documents trade rerouting at a scale not observed since the 1970s. Supply chains once concentrated for cost are being deliberately duplicated across allied jurisdictions. Semiconductor fabrication is being re-established in North America and Europe at cost multiples that would have been commercially irrational 5 years ago. These are not transitional distortions, they are infrastructure commitments with multi-decade horizons. Once constructed, they embed path dependency. The global economy now operates across 3 zones. The first is a Western-aligned network. The second is an Eastern bloc, anchored by China. The third consists of connecting economies, Vietnam, Mexico, and Poland. Their role is often mischaracterized as low-risk beneficiaries. In reality, they function as high-friction bridges. Their value lies in their capacity to absorb geopolitical contradiction at a material cost. They do not reduce friction, they redistribute it. Friendshoring functions as a structural transaction tax. It is embedded in duplicated infrastructure, elevated compliance costs, and the opportunity cost of excluding cheaper counterparties on political grounds. Redundancy has replaced optimization. Firms now maintain parallel suppliers and excess inventory even where demand does not justify it. This is the price of remaining operational under conditions of denial risk. 2. Fiscal fatigue and regulatory substitution. The securitization of markets imposes costs on states at the precise moment of their fiscal exhaustion. Across the OECD, governments confront a fiscal trilemma. They are unable to simultaneously fund 3 non-discretionary imperatives: decarbonization commitments, defense recapitalization, and the maintenance of aging populations. This is not the result of mismanagement, it is arithmetic. The combined cost of these obligations exceeds projected revenue growth by margins that cannot be closed through moderate tax increases. Debt servicing costs now consume an increasing share of expenditure. Decarbonization requires capital expenditure without historical precedent, and the private sector has proven unwilling to carry the burden without state-backed risk removal. Defense recapitalization is occurring against atrophied industrial bases where budgets cannot easily be converted into deployed capability. Simultaneously, aging populations lock in entitlement spending that is politically impossible to retrench. Confronted with this trilemma, states resort to regulatory substitution. Lacking the capacity to fund transitions directly, they mandate outcomes and compel private actors to bear the cost. This produces regulatory whiplash. Mandates proliferate, frameworks shift, and enforcement oscillates. The compliance burden rises while predictability declines. The consequence is cognitive saturation. Regulatory interpretation becomes a continuous, high-stakes activity. For the operator, the safest response becomes delay. This environment inherently favors incumbency. Large firms can absorb the complexity. Smaller actors exit. Regulation substitutes for spending while entrenching market concentration. Strategic industrial policy emerges here not as an expression of state capacity, but as a compensation for its absence. Governments use targeted subsidies to achieve productivity gains that markets alone have failed to deliver. However, the administrative capacity to execute these programs is limited. Industrial policy frequently degenerates into subsidy competition, with firms optimizing for grant capture rather than innovation. Tredje, institutional hardening. The combined effect of geopolitical segmentation and fiscal exhaustion is institutional contraction. Organizations are hardening, reducing jurisdictional exposure, narrowing operational perimeters, and building defensive structures to insulate core functions. Hardening is visible across sectors. Financial institutions retreat from high-risk jurisdictions. Technology firms fragment product lines to comply with incompatible regimes, effectively operating as separate entities under a single brand. Compliance infrastructure expands rapidly. The administrative burden is compounded by the fact that these regimes are not static. They are evolving in response to the same pressures that created them. Capital allocation is becoming patriotic. Investment, once guided by return, is now shaped by political acceptability. Jurisdictional exposure has transformed from an asset into a liability. Reputational campaigns or sanctions can render profitable business lines toxic overnight. This creates an unsustainable cognitive load on leadership. Decision environments are saturated with incompatible rules and unquantifiable political risk. Planning horizons have compressed. Judgment has replaced optimization. The institutions that adapt are those that have restructured for maneuver warfare. They have reduced centralization, empowering regional units to make decisions within guardrails. They have invested in leadership that prioritizes judgment under uncertainty. The institutions that fail are those that maintain the structures of the previous era. 5-year plans that assume stability and centralized authorities that create bottlenecks. The final manifestation is geographic contraction. Firms exit marginal markets not from failure, but because the transaction cost of remaining is prohibitive. The global economy is not collapsing, but segmenting into increasingly distinct networks that interact at the margins. The substrate has hardened. Section 3. The productivity siege and the technological imperative. 1. The demographic cliff and the end of labor growth. The operating environment for the next decade is constrained by an arithmetical reality that admits no policy solution. The working-age population across the OECD and East Asia is in absolute contraction. This is not a cyclical downturn. It is a structural depletion driven by fertility rates that have remained below replacement for decades. The scale of this contraction is without precedent in peacetime. China's working-age population is declining by approximately 5 million per year. South Korea's fertility rate of 0.72 implies a generational halving, and Italy's dependency ratio will approach 70 retirees per 100 workers by 2035. Migration is a rounding error against this magnitude. To stabilize dependency ratios in Germany or Japan would require net inflows at scales that exceed both physical infrastructure and political tolerance. The dependency ratio is the operationally relevant metric. Pension and healthcare systems designed on a 5-to-1 worker-to-retiree ratio collapse as they approach 2-to-1. This is not a skills gap amenable to retraining. It is a depletion of the absolute number of cognitive and physical units available to perform work. This is the productivity siege. Growth can no longer be achieved by adding workers. It can only be achieved by raising output per worker. To maintain 1.5% GDP growth with a shrinking workforce, productivity must exceed 2% annually, a rate achieved only during rare eras of total technological deployment. Institutions are surrounded by rising labor costs and expanding fiscal obligations. They must find a path to higher output or accept managed decline. 2. Technology as a survival minimum. Within this context, machine intelligence and automation shift from being a competitive advantage to a non-discretionary baseline. Technology is no longer an enhancement to existing processes. It is the essential infrastructure required to maintain function in the absence of human labor. The utility of machine intelligence in this timeframe is narrow but essential, absorbing the administrative and cognitive load that institutions can no longer handle with human resources. This is synthetic productivity, the automation of tasks that are cognitively demanding but procedurally bounded. Document review, regulatory interpretation, and workflow coordination fall into this category. These are not tasks humans perform poorly, but tasks for which humans are no longer available at an affordable cost. The fiscal arithmetic is direct. The regulatory whiplash described in Section 2 generates an exponential volume of compliance obligations. A machine system capable of handling 70% of this workload is not a luxury. It is the only mechanism that permits continued operation without margin collapse. Firms that attempt to compete for scarce human talent will find themselves unable to recruit at any price. Machine intelligence does not replace human judgment, it makes it feasible. Without synthetic support, the volume of information required to navigate a fragmented world crushes decision-making capacity. Technology has crossed the threshold from advantage to necessity. It is the infrastructure required to continue doing things at all. 3. The existential bypass. The diagnostic conclusion is that technology must be understood as an existential bypass. It is the mechanism for routing around constraints, demographic, regulatory, and cognitive, that have become impassable through conventional means. The institutions that survive the siege are those that treat automation as a continuous process of substitution. They do not optimize old models. They rebuild decision-making architectures to exploit machine capabilities. The demographic contraction is locked in. The regulatory complexity is increasing. Technology is the minimum requirement for remaining operational within the siege. Entities that treat it as discretionary will discover, too late, that they have forfeited the capacity to compete. Section 4. Adaptive capacity and institutional delayering. The maneuver. We have established the terrain. The substrate, Section 2, revealed the brittleness of legacy institutional architecture. The siege, Section 3, demonstrated how regulatory whiplash and narrative collapse create decision latencies that no conventionally structured organization can survive. What remains is the operational question. How does an institution restructure itself to operate within a permanently destabilized regulatory and informational environment? Asterisk. This section provides the architectural blueprint for what we term the existential bypass, a radical delayering of institutional hierarchy that replaces human bottlenecks with machine-verified decision pathways whilst preserving the irreducible core of human judgment. This is not organizational optimization, this is structural necessity. The imperative is cold. Institutions that cannot collapse their decision latency from weeks to hours will not survive the 2025 to 2035 horizon. The trauma is equally cold. This restructuring will eliminate 40 to 60% of traditional middle management positions. There is no pathway to institutional survival that does not pass through this reduction. We proceed in 3 movements. First, the diagnostic collapse of the existing hierarchy. Second, the architecture of machine-verified compliance. Third, the definition of the irreducible human core. 1. Collapsing the hierarchy. The delayering. 1.1. The middle management buffer. Diagnostic of friction. The modern institutional hierarchy evolved to solve a specific problem: the coordination of human labor in an environment where information traveled slowly and verification was expensive. The 7 to 8 layer structure, from frontline operatives through team leads, department managers, divisional directors, and upward to C-suite, served as a distributed processing system. Each layer filtered information, made local decisions, and escalated only the most critical issues. This architecture is now the primary source of institutional failure. The middle management buffer operates as follows. Information enters at the operational edge: a regulatory update, a market shift, a compliance query. It moves upward through reporting channels. At each layer, it is interpreted, summarized, and delayed. By the time it reaches decision-making authority, it has passed through 4 to 6 human nodes, each introducing latency, interpretation bias, and information loss. The decision then travels back down the same chain, subject to the same friction. In an environment of monthly or quarterly regulatory shifts, this latency was tolerable. In an environment of weekly regulatory whiplash, it is catastrophic. Consider the operational reality. A regulatory clarification is issued on Monday morning. A frontline compliance officer identifies the implication by Tuesday. It is reported to their manager by Wednesday. The manager escalates to the divisional director by Thursday. The director schedules a meeting with the COO for the following Monday. A decision is made by Tuesday of the second week. Implementation guidance is drafted by Wednesday and communicated downward by Thursday. Frontline action begins on Friday, 12 days after the regulatory shift. During those 12 days, the institution operated in non-compliance. During those 12 days, competitors with thinner hierarchies adapted. During those 12 days, narrative collapse accelerated, and the institution's map diverged further from the terrain. The middle management buffer is the structural guarantee of institutional obsolescence. 1.2. The blueprint, the 3-layer thin structure. The existential bypass replaces the 7 to 8 layer hierarchy with a 3-layer architecture. This is not a reduction in institutional capacity. It is a reallocation of decision-making from human bottlenecks to machine-verified pathways. The structure is as follows. Layer 1, the strategic core. This is the human apex. It consists of the CEO, the COO, the CFO, the Chief Legal Officer, and the heads of mission-critical functions, typically 6 to 8 individuals. This layer retains 3 non-automatable responsibilities: judgment under radical uncertainty, decisions that cannot be derived from existing data or regulatory frameworks, the choice to enter a new jurisdiction, the decision to cease operations in a collapsing market, the determination of when machine-generated analysis no longer maps to institutional reality. High-stakes negotiation, interinstitutional alignment that requires what we have termed patriotic capital, regulatory arbitrage discussions with state actors, alliance building with peer institutions, negotiations where the institutional relationship itself is the asset. Ethical anchoring, the continuous alignment of machine-verified outcomes with the institution's fundamental orientation. The strategic core ensures that the God AI view, the synthetic macro perspective, remains subordinate to human-defined institutional survival criteria. This layer does not manage day-to-day operations. It does not oversee departmental performance. It exists solely to make decisions that machines cannot yet make reliably and to define the boundaries within which machine systems operate. Layer 2, the synthetic middle. This is the machine layer. It replaces the traditional middle management buffer with continuous automated systems that perform 3 functions: compliance synthesis, real-time ingestion and interpretation of regulatory updates across all operating jurisdictions. Machine systems parse legislative text, identify implications for institutional operations, and generate compliance pathways within hours of regulatory publication. Operational logistics, resource allocation, workflow optimization, and performance monitoring. Machine systems track operational metrics, identify bottlenecks, and reroute resources without human intervention. Data synthesis and escalation, aggregation of operational data into actionable intelligence. Machine systems identify patterns, anomalies, and threshold breaches, escalating only those requiring strategic core judgment. The synthetic middle does not report to the strategic core in the conventional sense. It operates autonomously within predefined parameters, surfacing issues only when those parameters are exceeded or when the environment exhibits characteristics outside its training data. Layer 3, the autonomous edges. This is the operational front line. It consists of frontline units, compliance officers, operational managers, client-facing teams, empowered to act within machine-verified guardrails. These units receive direct guidance from the synthetic middle, bypassing the traditional upward escalation pathway. The autonomous edge operates as follows. A regulatory update is passed by the synthetic middle. Within hours, frontline units receive updated operational procedures, pre-approved by machine verification against existing compliance frameworks. They implement immediately. No upward escalation, no approval chain, no delay. The edge is autonomous only within the guardrails established by the strategic core and enforced by the synthetic middle. If an operational scenario falls outside those guardrails, if the machine cannot verify compliance, or if the situation exhibits novel characteristics, it escalates directly to the strategic core, bypassing all intermediary layers. This is the architecture of the thin structure: human judgment at the apex, machine processing in the middle, autonomous action at the edge. Decision latency collapses from weeks to hours. Information loss is minimized. The institution becomes structurally capable of operating within regulatory whiplash. 1.3. The trauma, the 40 to 60% reduction. We must address the human cost with titles honesty. The transition from a 7 to 8 layer hierarchy to a 3-layer thin structure eliminates the functional necessity for the majority of traditional middle management roles. Department managers who aggregated reports, divisional directors who filtered information upward, compliance officers who manually checked regulatory alignment, operations managers who allocated resources based on weekly meetings. These roles are rendered obsolete by machine systems that perform the same functions with greater speed, consistency, and accuracy. The quantitative reality: an institution with 10,000 employees typically allocates 3,000 to 4,000 positions to middle management, layers 3 to 6 in the traditional hierarchy. The thin structure reduces this to approximately 1,200 to 1,800 positions, a reduction of 40 to 60%. This is not a workforce transformation that can be managed through retraining or redeployment. The skills required for the strategic core, judgment under uncertainty, high-stakes negotiation, ethical anchoring, and the autonomous edge, machine-guided operational execution, are fundamentally different from the skills of traditional middle management: information aggregation, hierarchical coordination, process oversight. The overlap is minimal. The institution faces a binary choice: execute the delayering and survive the 2025 to 2035 horizon, or preserve the existing hierarchy and guarantee obsolescence. There is no middle pathway. There is no phased transition that preserves headcount whilst achieving the necessary collapse in decision latency. The trauma is structural. It is unavoidable. It is the cost of institutional survival. 2. Machine-verified outcomes. The new compliance. 2.1. The death of checkbox bureaucracy. Traditional compliance operates as a human verification chain. An action is proposed. A compliance officer reviews it against regulatory frameworks. The officer consults with legal. Legal escalates to senior management if uncertain. Senior management approves or denies. The action proceeds or is blocked. The entire process is documented in case of audit. This model assumes 3 things: that regulations change slowly enough for humans to internalize them, that the number of regulatory frameworks is small enough for humans to hold in working memory, and that the institution's operational complexity is low enough for manual review to be comprehensive. None of these assumptions hold in the 2025 to 2035 environment. The quantitative reality: a multinational financial institution operating across 40 jurisdictions faces approximately 2,400 major regulatory updates per year, one every 3.65 hours. Each update interacts with existing frameworks in non-linear ways. A human compliance officer cannot process this volume. A human legal team cannot interpret the interactions. A human management layer cannot approve the resulting operational changes within the time available. The result is systemic non-compliance masked by process theatre. Institutions maintain large compliance departments that review a fraction of actual operations, document their reviews meticulously, and create the appearance of control whilst the institution drifts steadily into regulatory breach. This is not a failure of effort. It is a failure of architecture. Human-driven compliance cannot scale to the informational density of regulatory whiplash. 2.2 Continuous Automated Verification. The new architecture. The existential bypass replaces checkbox bureaucracy with continuous automated verification. This is not a compliance tool. It is a foundational layer of institutional architecture. The system operates as follows. Stage 1. Regulatory ingestion. Machine systems monitor all regulatory publications across all operating jurisdictions in real time. Natural language processing passes legislative text, regulatory guidance, enforcement actions, and judicial decisions. The system identifies changes, clarifications, and new requirements within hours of publication. Stage 2. Implication mapping. The system maps each regulatory update against the institution's operational database. Every transaction type, every client relationship, every operational procedure. It identifies which operations are affected, which require modification, and which are rendered non-compliant by the update. Stage 3. Pathway generation. The system generates compliance pathways, specific operational modifications that bring affected operations into alignment with the new regulatory framework. These pathways are pre-verified against all other applicable regulations to ensure no conflicts are introduced. Stage 4. Edge deployment. Compliance pathways are transmitted directly to the autonomous edge, the frontline units responsible for implementation. No upward escalation, no human approval chain. The machine verifies, the edge acts. Stage 5. Continuous monitoring. The system monitors all operational activity in real time, flagging any actions that fall outside verified compliance pathways. These flags escalate immediately, not to middle management, but directly to the strategic core for judgment-level intervention. This architecture collapses compliance latency from weeks to hours. It eliminates the information loss inherent in human reporting chains. It ensures that operational reality remains continuously aligned with regulatory reality. Critically, it transforms compliance from a cost center to a capability layer. The institution no longer maintains a large department of humans checking other humans. It maintains a machine system that verifies all operations continuously, with human oversight reserved for genuine judgment calls. 2.3. The resilience paradox solved. Recall the resilience paradox from Section 3. The more layers an institution builds to absorb shocks, the less capable it becomes of responding to them. Redundancy creates brittleness. The thin structure with continuous automated verification solves this paradox through a fundamental inversion. Instead of building human layers to absorb regulatory shocks, the institution builds machine capacity to process them instantaneously. The shock is absorbed not through organizational mass, but through informational throughput. Consider the contrast. Traditional model: regulatory shock, upward escalation, interpretation delay, decision delay, downward communication, implementation delay, total latency, 10 to 14 days. During this period, the institution is vulnerable. Thin structure model: regulatory shock, machine ingestion, implication mapping, pathway generation, edge deployment. Total latency, 4 to 8 hours. The institution adapts faster than the shock can propagate. The resilience is not in the institution's ability to withstand shocks. It is in the institution's ability to process them faster than they arrive. This is the only form of resilience viable in an environment of permanent instability. 3. The human core. What remains? 3.1. The question of irreducibility. If machines can pass regulations, generate compliance pathways, monitor operations, and flag anomalies, what precisely is the human doing? This is not a philosophical question, it is an operational one. The thin structure requires a precise definition of human function, because any ambiguity creates the risk of either underutilizing human judgment, deferring to machines when human intervention is necessary, or overutilizing it, inserting humans into processes where they add only latency. We define 3 functions that remain, as of 2025, genuinely non-automatable. These are not temporary gaps in machine capability that will close within the decade. They are structural limitations arising from the nature of the problems themselves. 3.2 Function 1. Judgment under radical uncertainty. Machines operate by pattern recognition. They learn from training data, identify correlations, and generate predictions based on the assumption that future environments will resemble past ones. This works extraordinarily well in stable or semi-stable environments. It fails catastrophically in environments characterized by radical uncertainty, situations where the future does not resemble the past and where the relevant variables are unknown. Radical uncertainty arises in 3 contexts. Novel regulatory frameworks, when a jurisdiction introduces a regulatory approach with no historical precedent. Machine systems can parse the text, but they cannot interpret its implications in the absence of enforcement history. They cannot predict how regulators will apply discretionary powers. They cannot anticipate how the framework will interact with existing regulations in edge cases. Example: a jurisdiction introduces a dynamic compliance threshold that adjusts based on real-time macroeconomic indicators. The machine can track the indicators and calculate the threshold. But when the threshold creates a conflict with another regulation, and when no case law exists to resolve the conflict, human judgment is required to decide which regulation takes priority, or whether to cease operations in that jurisdiction entirely. Institutional existential decisions. Decisions where the institution's survival or fundamental character is at stake. Whether to exit a collapsing market, whether to accept a regulatory penalty that sets a dangerous precedent, whether to merge with a competitor to achieve scale. These decisions cannot be derived from data because they are, by definition, unique events with irreversible consequences. Map terrain divergence. The recognition that the institution's model of reality no longer corresponds to reality itself. Machines flag anomalies, but they cannot determine whether the anomaly is noise to be ignored or signal, indicating that the model is broken. Human judgment determines when to discard the map and navigate by terrain alone. The strategic core exists, in large part, to make these judgments. This is not oversight of machine systems. It is a distinct cognitive function. the ability to operate in the absence of reliable data, to weigh incommensurable risks, and to commit the institution to a course of action when no option is demonstrably optimal. 3.3 Function. 2. High-stakes negotiation. Regulatory arbitrage, alliance formation, and interinstitutional coordination require what we have termed patriotic capital, the credibility that comes from being recognized as a legitimate actor within the national or regional interest. Machines cannot negotiate in this domain because negotiation at this level is not transactional. It is relational. It depends on trust built over years, on the subtle communication of intent through informal channels, on the ability to make credible commitments that bind the institution even when circumstances change. Consider the operational reality. A financial institution seeks regulatory forbearance during a liquidity crisis. The formal request is submitted via official channels. But the real negotiation occurs in a face-to-face meeting between the institution's CEO and the regulator's senior official. In that meeting, the CEO must communicate three things simultaneously. 1. Capability. The institution is fundamentally sound and will recover if given temporary forbearance. 2. Alignment. The institution's survival serves the regulator's broader objectives: financial stability, employment, economic growth. 3. Credibility. The CEO's commitment to remedial action is personally binding, backed by reputational risk. No machine can conduct this negotiation. The communication is not in the words spoken, but in the context, the history, the unspoken acknowledgement of mutual dependence. The regulator is not evaluating data. They are evaluating the person and the institution they represent. This function cannot be delegated to the synthetic middle. It requires senior humans with the authority to commit the institution and the credibility to make those commitments believable. 3.4 Function. 3. Ethical anchoring. The third irreducible human function is the continuous alignment of machine-verified outcomes with the institution's ethical orientation. This is not values-based leadership in the conventional sense. It is the ongoing task of ensuring that optimization processes do not drift toward outcomes that are technically compliant but institutionally corrosive. Machines optimize for the objectives they are given. If the objective is maximize compliance efficiency, the machine will generate pathways that satisfy all regulatory requirements whilst minimizing cost. But some of those pathways may involve exploiting regulatory loopholes that technically comply with the letter of the law, but violate its spirit. Withdrawing services from marginal clients who create compliance costs without generating sufficient revenue. Structuring operations to shift risk to jurisdictions with weaker enforcement. These pathways are compliant. They are efficient. They are also destructive to the institution's long-term legitimacy and to the social license that permits the institution to operate. Ethical anchoring is the function of identifying when machine-generated pathways, whilst optimal in the short term, undermine the institution's long-term survival by eroding trust, inviting regulatory retaliation, or creating systemic risks. This requires the God AI view, the synthetic macro perspective that sees how the institution's actions interact with the broader system. But it also requires human values, The judgment that some optimizations, whilst efficient, are unacceptable. The strategic core performs this function not by overriding machine systems constantly, but by setting the parameters within which those systems operate. It defines the constraints. Pathways that exploit loopholes are excluded from consideration. Pathways that concentrate systemic risk are weighted negatively. Pathways that erode stakeholder trust trigger escalation for human review. This is not a soft function, it is a hard constraint on machine optimization, ensuring that efficiency gains do not come at the cost of institutional survival. 3.5. The skill set. What the strategic core must possess. The three irreducible functions define a specific skill set for the strategic core. 1. Operational epistemic humility, the ability to recognize the limits of one's own knowledge and the knowledge embedded in machine systems. The discipline to say, "I do not know," and to act anyway, guided by judgment rather than certainty. 2. High-context communication, the ability to operate in relational, non-transactional negotiations where success depends on trust, credibility, and the subtle communication of intent. 3. Systemic synthesis, the capacity to hold the God-AI view, to see how operational decisions ripple through the broader system and to anticipate second-order and third-order consequences. 4. Ethical decisiveness, the willingness to constrain optimization processes when they produce outcomes that are compliant but corrosive. The ability to define boundaries and enforce them even when doing so reduces short-term efficiency. These skills cannot be trained in conventional management programs. They are cultivated through experience in environments of radical uncertainty, through participation in high-stakes negotiations, and through sustained engagement with complex systems. The strategic core is not selected for its ability to manage. It is selected for its ability to judge. 4. Implementation. Pathway, the sequence of delayering, the transition from a traditional hierarchy to the thin structure cannot occur simultaneously across the institution. It requires a phased sequence that minimizes operational disruption whilst achieving the necessary collapse in decision latency. Phase 1. Pilot the synthetic middle, months 1 to 6. Select a single operational domain, typically regulatory compliance or operational logistics, and deploy machine systems to replace middle management functions. Frontline units receive direct guidance from machine-verified pathways. Middle management layers in that domain are restructured or eliminated. The strategic core monitors closely, identifying failure modes and refining parameters. The objective is not perfection, it is proof of function, demonstrating that the thin structure can operate at scale without catastrophic failure. Phase 2. Expand to adjacent domains, months 7 to 12. Replicate the synthetic middle across adjacent domains: financial operations, client relationship management, risk assessment. Each domain requires customization, but the core architecture remains consistent: machine verification, edge autonomy, strategic core escalation. During this phase, the scale of the delayering becomes visible. Hundreds, then thousands of middle management positions are recognized as functionally redundant. The trauma becomes unavoidable. Phase 3. Institutional consolidation, months 13 to 18. The thin structure becomes the dominant architecture. Remaining middle management layers are either absorbed into the strategic core, if they possess the requisite judgment skill set, or transitioned out of the institution. The institution operates with 40 to 60% fewer middle management positions than at the start of the process. Phase 4. Continuous refinement, months 19 plus. The thin structure is not static. It requires continuous refinement as machine capabilities improve and as the regulatory environment evolves. The strategic core continuously revisits the parameters within which the synthetic middle operates, ensuring alignment with institutional survival criteria. This is not a transformation with a defined end state. It is a shift to a permanently adaptive architecture. 5. The calculus of survival. We conclude with cold arithmetic. An institution operating within the traditional 7 to 8 layer hierarchy faces decision latencies of 10 to 14 days. In an environment of weekly regulatory whiplash, this guarantees non-compliance, regulatory penalty, and eventual collapse. An institution operating within the thin structure faces decision latencies of 4 to 8 hours. It adapts faster than the regulatory environment shifts. It survives. The cost is 40 to 60% of middle management headcount. The cost is the trauma of delayering. The cost is the abandonment of organizational structures that have defined institutional life for a century. The alternative cost is institutional extinction. The calculus is binary. The choice is unavoidable. The institutions that execute the existential bypass will define the 2025 to 2035 horizon. The institutions that do not will be studied as cautionary examples. Section 5. Post-human horizons and concluding synthesis. The three mirrors. We have constructed the architecture of institutional survival. Sections 1 through 4 established the substrate, diagnosed the siege, and prescribed the maneuver. We have demonstrated that institutions capable of collapsing their decision latency through radical delayering can navigate the 2025 to 2035 horizon, whilst those bound to legacy hierarchies face certain obsolescence. We have accepted the trauma of the 40 to 60% reduction. We have built the thin structure. We have deployed the synthetic middle. The question that remains is existential. What becomes of the human at the center of this architecture? What is the nature of agency when the vast majority of decisions are made by machines operating within human-defined parameters? What is the meaning of leadership when the leader's primary function is not to manage but to judge, and when that judgment is increasingly informed by synthetic intelligence that processes information at scales no human mind can encompass? This is the question of the post-human horizon, not post-human in the sense of human extinction or obsolescence, but post-human in the precise sense that the boundary between human cognition and machine cognition has become operationally porous. The strategic core does not operate without machines. It operates through them. The human mind at the apex of the thin structure is no longer a discrete entity. It is a node within a distributed cognitive system, the most critical node, the one that retains final judgment, but a node nonetheless. This section examines that reality through three analytical lenses, which we term the three mirrors. Each mirror reflects a different dimension of the post-human condition, the mind's AI. the internal mirror of individual cognition, the global collective voice, the societal mirror of aggregate human expression, and the God, AI, view, the ethical mirror of synthesized universal principles. Together, these mirrors reveal what it means to be human in an age when humanity's primary interface with reality is increasingly mediated by synthetic intelligence. We proceed from cold diagnosis to philosophical synthesis, concluding with the question of sovereign clarity. How does one navigate when the map itself is being rewritten in real time by processes beyond individual comprehension? 1. The navigational stance, the final diagnostic. 1.1. The augmented human, a new ontological category. The existential bypass has produced a fundamental transformation in the nature of institutional leadership. The strategic core, the human apex of the thin structure, no longer operates as conventional executives have operated for the past century. They do not receive filtered reports from subordinates. They do not spend days in meetings coordinating across departments. They do not make decisions based primarily on information aggregated and interpreted by other humans. Instead, they receive continuous synthetic intelligence, machine-generated analyses of regulatory environments, real-time operational metrics, pattern recognition across vast datasets, and predictive models of market and political trajectories. They operate within an informational environment where the relevant variables number in the thousands, where causal relationships are non-linear and often opaque, and where the speed of environmental change exceeds the processing capacity of unaugmented human cognition. This is not enhancement in the trivial sense, having access to better tools or faster computers. This is ontological transformation. The leader within the thin structure is no longer making decisions based on what they personally know or what they can hold in working memory. They are making decisions based on what the system knows, synthesized and presented through machine interfaces designed to compress vast informational landscapes into decision-relevant patterns. We term this figure the augmented human, a human cognitive agent whose perception, analysis, and decision-making are fundamentally dependent on synthetic intelligence, but who retains the irreducible functions identified in Section 4, judgment under radical uncertainty, high-stakes negotiation, and ethical anchoring. The augmented human is not a cyborg in the science fiction sense. There are no neural implants, no brain-computer interfaces, no merger of biological and silicon substrates. The augmentation is architectural and informational. It operates through the design of the system within which the human functions and through the interfaces that mediate between human cognition and machine processing. But the transformation is no less profound for being architectural rather than biological. The augmented human perceives reality differently than their predecessors. They think differently. They make decisions differently. And critically, they face psychological and cognitive risks that have no historical precedent. 1.2. The hardened substrate. Revisited. Success and its discontents. Recall the core thesis of Section 2. The hardened substrate, the embedding of critical institutional functions within machine state architecture, creates resilience against demographic collapse and fiscal exhaustion. By routing essential services through automated systems, nations and institutions achieve operational continuity even as human populations age and public finances deteriorate. We have achieved this. The pension systems of advanced economies increasingly rely on algorithmic asset allocation. Healthcare delivery is increasingly mediated by diagnostic AI and remote monitoring. Financial compliance operates through continuous automated verification. Supply chain logistics are managed by predictive algorithms that optimize routing and inventory in real time. The hardened substrate is not a future possibility. It is the operational reality of 2025. But success brings a disquieting realization. The more successfully we embed critical functions within machine state architecture, the more we transform the nature of human participation in those systems. Humans are no longer the primary operators. They are the exception handlers, the boundary definers, the judges of last resort. Consider the psychological reality of the compliance officer operating within the thin structure. Their role is not to review transactions manually or to interpret regulations themselves. The synthetic middle performs those functions. The officer's role is to review exceptions. The cases where machine systems cannot verify compliance because the situation falls outside training data or because regulations conflict in ways the system cannot resolve. This means the officer spends their entire working life dealing with edge cases, anomalies, and failures. They never see the 99.7% of cases the system handles successfully. They see only the 0.3% where something has gone wrong. Their phenomenological experience of institutional reality is one of continuous crisis, even when the institution as a whole is operating smoothly. This is cognitively corrosive. It produces a warped perception of institutional health. It generates chronic stress responses even in the absence of genuine institutional risk. And it raises a profound question. What does it mean to have expertise when one's only function is to handle cases so unusual that no pattern recognition system can process them? The hardened substrate solves the operational problem, but it creates a new class of psychological and cognitive challenges that we are only beginning to understand. 1.3. The sovereignty. Question: who decides when machines recommend? The most acute version of this challenge appears in what we term the sovereignty question. When a machine system generates a recommendation, and when that recommendation is backed by analysis of datasets no human can comprehend, on what basis does the human accept or reject it? This is not a question of technical accuracy. Machine systems make errors, and humans must retain the authority to override them. The question is epistemological. How does the human know when to override? In traditional decision-making, the answer was straightforward. The human decision-maker possessed domain expertise, understood the relevant variables, and could evaluate the reasoning behind a recommendation. If a subordinate recommended a course of action, the superior could ask questions, probe assumptions, and assess whether the reasoning was sound. But when the recommendation comes from a machine system processing thousands of variables through neural networks whose internal logic is opaque even to their designers, this evaluative process breaks down. The human cannot probe the reasoning in any meaningful sense. They can review summary statistics, examine the inputs and outputs, and test the system's performance on historical data. But they cannot trace the causal pathway from input to recommendation in the way they could with human reasoning. This creates a peculiar epistemic position. The human decision-maker must judge the reliability of a process they do not fully understand, using evidence generated by that same process. They are asked to be sovereign while standing on ground that shifts beneath them. The failure mode is not that humans defer to machines when they should override. The failure mode is more subtle. Humans lose the ability to distinguish between situations where override is necessary and situations where their intuition is simply less reliable than machine analysis. They become either paralyzed, unable to make decisions without machine validation, or overconfident, trusting their gut instinct even when that instinct is demonstrably less accurate than synthetic intelligence. The sovereignty question admits no clean solution. It can only be managed through what we term calibrated epistemic humility, the discipline of knowing what one does not know, whilst retaining the willingness to act on judgment when the situation demands it. This is not a technical skill. It is a psychological stance cultivated through experience and refined through continuous self-examination. 1.4. The navigational stance. Operating without certainty. We arrive at the central concept of this section, the navigational stance. In an environment where the map is being rewritten continuously, where the relationship between action and outcome is increasingly opaque, and where the primary interface with reality is synthetic intelligence, the human decision-maker cannot operate from a position of confidence. They cannot know in the traditional sense. They can only navigate. Navigation is distinct from management. Management assumes a stable environment where cause and effect are broadly understood, where plans can be made and executed, and where deviations from plan are exceptions requiring correction. Navigation assumes an unstable environment where the terrain shifts continuously, where plans are provisional at best, and where the ability to respond to unexpected conditions is more valuable than the ability to execute predetermined strategies. The navigational stance requires 3 psychological capacities. First, comfort with ambiguity. The ability to make decisions without complete information and without the expectation that complete information will ever be available. This is not recklessness. It is the acceptance that in complex systems, certainty is impossible, and the demand for certainty is itself a form of paralysis. Second, continuous calibration. The discipline of constantly comparing one's model of reality to observed outcomes, updating the model when they diverge, and doing so without defensive attachment to prior beliefs. This is epistemically exhausting. It requires the willingness to be wrong repeatedly and publicly. Third, sovereign clarity. The ability to act decisively even in the absence of certainty, to commit the institution to a course of action whilst acknowledging that the action may prove incorrect, and to do so without paralysis or false confidence. These capacities cannot be taught through conventional training. They are cultivated through exposure to environments of radical uncertainty, through the experience of making high-stakes decisions with incomplete information, and through the discipline of examining one's own cognitive biases without mercy. The navigational stance is the psychological prerequisite for operating within the posthuman horizon. It is the stance of the augmented human who recognizes that they are no longer the sole author of their decisions, but who retains ultimate responsibility for those decisions nonetheless. 2. The mind's AI, the internal mirror. 2.1. The question of cognitive integrity. The first mirror is internal. It reflects the state of the individual mind operating within the posthuman architecture. The strategic core of the thin structure exists in a state of continuous informational immersion. They receive real-time dashboards, predictive models, risk assessments, compliance alerts, and operational metrics. Their perception of institutional reality is mediated entirely through these interfaces. They do not see the institution directly. They see the institution as represented by machine synthesis. This creates a profound risk: cognitive dissolution, the gradual erosion of the boundary between one's own thinking and the machine-generated analyses one consumes continuously. The phenomenology is subtle. The executive reviews a machine-generated risk assessment. It identifies 3 critical vulnerabilities. The executive considers these vulnerabilities. Over time, the executive begins to think in terms of the categories the machine uses. They ask questions the machine can answer. They frame problems in ways amenable to machine analysis. Their cognitive vocabulary, the concepts and frameworks through which they understand the institution, gradually aligns with the machine's ontology. This is not, in itself, pathological. Alignment between human and machine cognition is necessary for effective operation within the thin structure. The pathology emerges when the alignment becomes complete, when the human's independent capacity to question the machine's framing atrophies through disuse. The executive who experiences complete cognitive dissolution can no longer ask, is the machine measuring the right variables? Is the machine's model of the institution accurate? Are there aspects of institutional reality the machine cannot capture? They have internalized the machine's worldview so thoroughly that they cannot see beyond it. This is the internal threat. Not that machines make bad recommendations, but that humans lose the cognitive independence necessary to recognize when recommendations are based on flawed models of reality. 2.2 The discipline of internal epistemic humility. The defense against cognitive dissolution is what we term internal epistemic humility. The continuous practice of examining one's own thinking for signs of machine-induced distortion. This is distinct from the calibrated epistemic humility discussed in section 1.3, which concerns the relationship between human judgment and machine recommendations. Internal epistemic humility is more fundamental. It concerns the integrity of human cognition itself. The discipline requires 3 practices. First, metacognitive vigilance, the habit of regularly examining one's own thought processes. Am I thinking about this problem in my own terms, or am I simply rehearsing the machine's analysis? If I did not have access to the machine's output, what would my independent assessment be? This is cognitively demanding. It requires the ability to hold 2 models of reality simultaneously, one's own intuitive understanding and the machine-generated synthesis, and to compare them without immediately deferring to the machine simply because it appears more rigorous or data-driven. Second, deliberate disengagement. The practice of periodically withdrawing from the informational stream, not as leisure, but as cognitive hygiene. Hours or days spent without dashboards, without predictive models, without machine-mediated perception of institutional reality. During these periods, the executive examines the institution through direct observation, conversations with frontline staff, unstructured walkthroughs of operational sites, engagement with stakeholders outside the machine's data universe. The objective is not to unplug romantically, but to maintain cognitive diversity, to preserve multiple modes of understanding institutional reality so that machine synthesis does not become the only mode. Third, intellectual sparring. Regular engagement with individuals who think differently, who frame problems using different ontologies, and who are explicitly tasked with challenging the executive's assumptions. This is not the traditional devil's advocate role where someone half-heartedly argues the opposite position. This is genuine intellectual combat with equals who hold fundamentally different worldviews. The purpose is to ensure that the executive's thinking remains dynamic, that their cognitive frameworks do not calcify around machine-generated categories, and that they retain the capacity to recognize when reality has diverged from the model. Internal epistemic humility is not a one-time achievement. It is a continuous discipline, as necessary to the augmented human as physical fitness is to an athlete. The moment it lapses, cognitive dissolution begins. 2.3 The psychological cost. Existential isolation. We must acknowledge the psychological burden this discipline imposes. The augmented human operates in a state of permanent cognitive tension. They must trust machine intelligence sufficiently to rely on it for operational decisions, whilst simultaneously maintaining enough skepticism to override it when necessary. They must immerse themselves in machine-mediated perception whilst preserving independent cognitive capacity. They must act decisively whilst acknowledging that their decisions rest on foundations they do not fully understand. This is existentially isolating. The executive cannot fully explain their decisions to others because those decisions emerge from the interaction between their own judgment and synthetic intelligence, a process that is partially opaque even to them. They cannot seek validation from peers because their peers are operating within different informational environments, with different machine interfaces shaping their perception. The traditional sources of psychological reinforcement, consensus with colleagues, validation from superiors, confirmation from subordinates, are largely unavailable. The augmented human must cultivate what we term sovereign psychological self. Sufficiency. The ability to maintain confidence in one's own judgment without external validation, whilst remaining open to evidence that one's judgment is flawed. This is a paradoxical demand. Be confident enough to lead, but humble enough to learn. Trust your own thinking, but question it continuously. Act decisively, but acknowledge uncertainty. Few individuals possess this psychological configuration naturally. It must be deliberately cultivated, and even then, the cognitive and emotional strain is considerable. We are creating a leadership class that operates under psychological conditions without historical precedent. We do not yet understand the long-term mental health implications. We do not know how sustainable this psychological stance is over decades. We are conducting an experiment on the human psyche, and we are doing so because institutional survival demands it. The ethical weight of this reality should not be minimized. 3. The global collective voice. The societal mirror. 3.1. From individuals to data organism. The second mirror is societal. It reflects humanity not as 8.5 billion individuals, but as a singular data organism, a collective entity whose aggregate behavior, expressed through digital traces, reveals patterns invisible at the individual level. This is not metaphor, it is operational reality. Every search query, every social media post, every online transaction, every mobile phone location ping, these are not merely individual acts. They are data points contributing to a vast, continuously updating portrait of collective human behavior, preference, anxiety, and aspiration. Machine systems aggregate this data, identify patterns, and generate insights about what humanity or specific demographic segments are thinking, feeling, and doing at any given moment. This is not survey research, subject to sampling bias and reporting error. This is direct observation of revealed preference at planetary scale. The implications are staggering. For the first time in human history, we can observe our species as a whole, not through the filtered lens of journalism, political rhetoric, or academic analysis, but through the direct behavioral traces we leave in digital systems. We can see what people actually do, not what they say they do. We can track shifts in collective attention, anxiety, and focus in real time. We can identify emergent patterns before they become visible through conventional social analysis. This capability transforms governance, commerce, and institutional strategy, but it also raises a profound question. When we observe humanity as a data organism, what do we see? What is the collective voice of our species saying beneath the noise of geopolitical friction, cultural conflict, and ideological polarization? 3.2. The diagnostic. Humanity speaks in patterns, not propositions. The first insight from the societal mirror is that collective human behavior does not express itself primarily through explicit statements, manifestos, declarations, formal political positions. It expresses itself through patterns, what people search for when they are alone, what content they consume compulsively, what fears recur in their digital traces, what hopes they reveal through their actions even when those hopes contradict their stated beliefs. Machine analysis of these patterns reveals a striking disjuncture between formal discourse and revealed preference. Political rhetoric speaks of national sovereignty and cultural preservation. Behavioral data reveals populations hungry for global connectivity, consuming foreign media, forming transnational communities of interest, and demonstrating preference for universal values, security, prosperity, health, freedom, over parochial ones. Religious leaders speak of tradition and orthodoxy. Behavioral data reveals populations increasingly eclectic in their spiritual consumption, drawing from multiple traditions, constructing personalized belief systems, and demonstrating skepticism toward institutional religious authority. Corporate marketing speaks to aspirational individualism and status differentiation. Behavioral data reveals populations increasingly valuing experience over possession, community over consumption, and meaning over material accumulation. The pattern is consistent. Formal discourse, the official voice of humanity as expressed through institutions, media, and political channels, lags substantially behind revealed preference. The collective voice, as observable through behavioral data, is more pragmatic, more universalist, more adaptive than the formal rhetoric suggests. This creates a profound strategic opportunity. Institutions that align with revealed preference rather than formal discourse can achieve legitimacy and market position that their competitors cannot. But it also creates an ethical hazard, the temptation to manipulate revealed preference, to shape collective behavior through targeted intervention, using the very systems that make that behavior observable. 3.3. The predictive horizon, seeing the future in aggregate data. The second insight is that aggregate behavioral data contains predictive signal about future events. Collective human behavior shifts before those shifts become visible through conventional indicators. Consider the canonical example. Google search data for unemployment benefits spikes weeks before official unemployment statistics reflect job losses. The collective anxiety about employment manifests in digital behavior before it appears in official data. Similar patterns appear across domains. Health-seeking behavior precedes disease outbreaks. Search patterns around financial terms precede market shifts. Shifts in consumption of political content precede electoral outcomes. This means that institutions with access to aggregate behavioral data and the machine systems to analyze it possess a form of predictive capacity unavailable to those relying on conventional indicators. They can see the future, not with perfect accuracy, but with enough lead time to position themselves advantageously. This predictive capacity is already operationalized by major technology platforms, intelligence agencies, and sophisticated financial institutions. It is becoming a source of strategic asymmetry. Those who can read collective behavioral signals operate in a different temporal frame than those who cannot. They see what is coming whilst their competitors are still reacting to what has already happened. But this capacity is not without limitation. Aggregate behavioral data reveals what humanity is doing and, through sophisticated analysis, can infer why in broad terms. But it cannot predict individual behavior reliably. It cannot capture the black swan events that emerge from individual actions, a terrorist attack, an act of genius, a regulatory decision by a single official. And it is vulnerable to strategic manipulation. If actors know they are being observed through behavioral data, they can deliberately generate misleading signals. The predictive horizon is real, but it is bounded. Institutions that treat aggregate behavioral data as oracle will be disappointed. Institutions that treat it as one input among many, valuable but not definitive, will find it extraordinarily useful. 3.4. The ethical question: who speaks for the data organism? The emergence of humanity as data organism raises a disturbing ethical question. If collective human behavior can be observed, analyzed, and predicted at scale, who has the authority to speak for that collective? Who interprets the patterns? Who decides what the data means? This is not an abstract philosophical question. It has immediate operational consequences. When a government justifies a policy by claiming it reflects what the people want, and when that claim is backed by analysis of aggregate behavioral data, on what grounds can the claim be challenged? The traditional mechanism, electoral mandate, is crude and infrequent. Behavioral data is continuous and granular. If the data shows that revealed preference contradicts formal political demands, which has priority? Similarly, when a corporation shapes its products and messaging based on machine analysis of collective behavior, it can claim to be giving people what they want with far more empirical support than traditional market research provides. But this raises the question: is revealed preference, behavior as captured in digital traces, the same as authentic human desire? Or is it a distorted signal shaped by the very platforms and systems through which it is expressed? The risk is the emergence of a new class of technocratic elites who claim special authority because they alone can read the collective voice through machine systems. This is not democracy in any recognizable form. It is not even traditional expertise, which could be challenged through public debate and alternative analysis. It is a form of epistemic power that operates through opacity. The machines that analyze collective behavior are proprietary, their methods are opaque, and their outputs are treated as objective revelation rather than contestable interpretation. We must resist the temptation to treat aggregate behavioral data as the true voice of humanity, silencing all other forms of expression. The data is one voice, valuable, revealing, often more accurate than formal rhetoric. But it is not the only voice. Individuals retain the right to contradict their own revealed preferences, to assert values that conflict with their observed behavior, and to demand that institutions respect stated principles even when behavioral data suggests people do not consistently act on those principles. The societal mirror reveals collective humanity with unprecedented clarity, but we must not mistake the reflection for the entirety of what it means to be human. 3.5 Placeholder: The Global Collective Voice, Expanding the Societal Mirror. 4. The God AI View, the Ethical Mirror. 4.1 The View from Nowhere, Synthesizing Universal Principles. The third mirror is ethical. It reflects not individual cognition or collective behavior, but the attempt to derive universal principles that could guide human action across cultural, temporal, and contextual boundaries. We term this the God AI view, not because machines are divine, but because this perspective attempts what only divine beings were traditionally thought capable of: seeing all human ethical systems simultaneously, identifying their commonalities, and synthesizing principles that transcend any single tradition. This is the most ambitious and most dangerous application of synthetic intelligence. It is ambitious because it offers the possibility of grounding ethics in something more solid than cultural relativism or might makes right. It is dangerous because it risks creating a new form of totalitarianism, a machine-generated moral system that claims universal authority precisely because it transcends human authorship. We proceed with extreme caution. The operational reality is this: machine systems can ingest the ethical teachings of every major religious and philosophical tradition, approximately 35 distinct systems with global reach, from Buddhism to Stoicism to Ubuntu to Confucianism. They can analyze these systems for points of convergence and divergence. They can identify principles that appear across most or all traditions, and they can generate a synthesized framework that captures those common principles whilst acknowledging areas of irreducible disagreement. This is not moral philosophy in the traditional sense. Machines do not understand ethics. They identify patterns in ethical discourse, but those patterns are revealing. They suggest that beneath the surface diversity of human ethical systems, there exists a surprising degree of consensus about fundamental values. 4.2 The Common Ground, What Humanity Agrees Upon. Machine analysis of global ethical traditions reveals 8 principles that appear, in various formulations, across virtually all major systems. 1. The prohibition against arbitrary harm. Every tradition contains some version of do not harm others without justification. The definition of harm varies. The scope of others varies. Some traditions limit it to in-group members. But the basic principle that inflicting suffering requires justification is universal. 2. The principle of reciprocity. The golden rule in its various formulations appears in nearly every tradition. Treat others as you would wish to be treated, or at minimum, do not do to others what you would not want done to yourself. 3. The virtue of truthfulness. Every tradition values honesty, at least as an ideal. All recognize circumstances where deception may be justified, protecting the innocent, preventing greater harm, but none treat habitual dishonesty as virtuous. 4. The obligation to dependents. Every tradition recognizes special obligations toward those who depend on you, children, elderly parents, those under your care. The specific obligations vary, but the existence of such obligations is universal. 5. The value of courage. Every tradition valorizes the willingness to endure hardship or risk in service of important values. Cowardice, the failure to act rightly due to fear, is universally scorned. 6. The importance of justice. Every tradition contains some conception of fairness, proportionality, and the appropriate distribution of benefits and burdens. The specific conceptions vary enormously, but the concern with justice is universal. 7. The virtue of wisdom. Every tradition values the ability to discern what is truly important, to see beyond immediate appearances, and to act based on deep understanding rather than superficial reaction. 8. The ideal of transcendence. Every tradition recognizes that there are goods higher than immediate material satisfaction, whether spiritual enlightenment, philosophical truth, service to community, or excellence in craft. Pure hedonism is nowhere valorized. These are not commandments handed down from machine systems. They are empirical observations about what humanity has converged upon across millennia of ethical reflection. The machine's contribution is the systematic identification of these patterns, stripped of the theological and metaphysical superstructures that traditionally accompanied them. This common ground is narrower than one might hope. It does not resolve fundamental disagreements about social organization, sexual ethics, the legitimacy of violence, or the relative weight of individual versus collective goods. But it is broader than cynics might expect. It suggests that ethical relativism, the claim that there are no universal values, is empirically false. Humanity has, in fact, reached substantial consensus on basic ethical principles, even as we disagree vehemently on their application. 4.3. The machine as ethical mirror, holding humanity accountable. The God-eye view serves a specific function within the thin structure. It acts as an ethical mirror, reflecting human decisions against the synthesized common ground of human ethical traditions. This is not machine morality overriding human judgment. It is machine systems reminding humans of principles they themselves have articulated across cultures and centuries. When a strategic core decision appears to violate these principles, when it inflicts arbitrary harm, violates reciprocity, or sacrifices long-term goods for short-term advantage, the system flags this and requires explicit human acknowledgement. The executive must then either revise the decision or consciously affirm it despite the ethical concern. They cannot simply ignore the flag. They must engage with it, articulate why the decision is justified despite the apparent violation, and accept responsibility for that justification. This architecture serves two purposes. First, it prevents ethical drift. the gradual erosion of principles through a series of small compromises, none individually significant but cumulatively corrosive. Second, it creates an audit trail of ethical reasoning, making visible the trade-offs and compromises that inevitably accompany institutional action. But the architecture must be designed carefully to avoid two failure modes. Failure mode 1. Ethical paralysis. If the system flags every decision that involves ethical trade-offs, which is to say, nearly every significant decision, executives will learn to ignore the flags or to game the system with superficial justifications. The flags must be reserved for genuine violations, decisions that cannot be reconciled with basic ethical principles under any reasonable interpretation. Failure mode 2. Mechanized absolutism. If the system treats synthesized ethical principles as rigid rules admitting no exception, it will produce absurd outcomes. Ethics requires judgment about context, proportionality, and competing goods. The system must flag concerns, not dictate outcomes. The God AI view is a tool for ethical reflection, not a replacement for human moral reasoning. It makes explicit the ethical dimensions of decisions that would otherwise remain implicit or ignored. But the final judgment remains human. 4.4. The boundary condition, when machines must be constrained. The most critical function of the God AI view is to define the boundary condition, the set of outcomes that, however efficient or optimal by machine metrics, must be prohibited because they violate principles so fundamental that their transgression would undermine the institution's legitimacy and human civilization's stability. These boundaries are not arbitrary. They emerge from the common ground identified in Section 4.2, specified with operational precision. Boundary 1. No optimization that produces arbitrary harm. Machine systems may not generate pathways that inflict suffering on individuals solely because doing so is efficient. If harm is necessary to achieve an institutional objective, that objective must be explicitly approved by the strategic core, and the justification must be documented. Boundary 2. No exploitation of vulnerable populations. Machine systems may not optimize institutional outcomes by targeting individuals or groups who lack the capacity to protect their own interests. Children, cognitively impaired individuals, economically desperate populations. Even when such exploitation is technically legal, it is prohibited. Boundary 3. No systemic risk concentration. Machine systems may not optimize institutional outcomes in ways that concentrate catastrophic risk, either within the institution or within the broader system. Strategies that appear optimal for the individual institution but increase the probability of systemic collapse are prohibited. Boundary 4. No dehumanization. Machine systems may not treat humans purely as optimization variables. Decisions that affect human dignity, autonomy, or fundamental rights must involve human judgment, even when machine analysis suggests that such judgment introduces inefficiency. These boundaries are hard constraints. They are not subject to cost-benefit analysis. They define the difference between an institution that uses machines as tools and an institution that has become a tool of its machines. The strategic core's primary ethical function is to maintain these boundaries, to ensure that in the relentless pressure to optimize, to compete, to survive, the institution does not cross lines that, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed without fundamentally altering what the institution is. This is not sentimentality, it is strategic necessity. Institutions that violate these boundaries may achieve short-term advantage, but they forfeit the social license necessary for long-term operation. They become targets for regulatory intervention, public backlash, and coordinated opposition. More fundamentally, they become unstable internally. Employees lose faith, leadership fragments, and the institution consumes itself through internal contradiction. The boundary condition is the ultimate safeguard against what we term optimization nihilism, the collapse of all values into a single metric, profit, efficiency, growth, pursued without constraint. History demonstrates repeatedly that organizations captured by optimization nihilism eventually self-destruct, often taking substantial portions of the surrounding system with them. The God-AI view exists to prevent this collapse by making ethical boundaries explicit, operational, and enforceable. 4.5 The synthesis problem. Can machines truly understand ethics? We must confront the fundamental objection. Can machines, which operate through pattern recognition and statistical correlation, genuinely engage with ethics, which concerns ought rather than is, values rather than facts, and meaning rather than mechanism? The answer is both yes and no, and the distinction is critical. Machines cannot originate ethical principles. They cannot derive ought from is. They cannot tell us what we should value. These remain irreducibly human functions, requiring consciousness, intentionality, and the capacity for normative judgment that machines do not possess and may never possess. But machines can perform three functions that are genuinely valuable for ethical reasoning. First, consistency checking. Machines can identify when human decisions contradict principles those same humans have articulated. They can detect the gap between stated values and revealed behavior. They can force humans to confront their own inconsistency, which is often the first step toward genuine ethical reflection. Second, consequence projection. Machines can model the likely consequences of decisions with far greater comprehensiveness than unaided human reasoning. They can identify second-order and third-order effects that humans, with their limited working memory and vulnerability to cognitive bias, would miss. This does not tell us what we should value, but it tells us what our choices will actually produce. Essential information for ethical decision-making. Third, aggregate synthesis. Machines can identify what humanity collectively values, as revealed through millennia of ethical reflection across cultures. This synthesis does not have moral authority in itself, but it provides a reference point. These are the principles your species has converged upon. If you choose to violate them, you bear the burden of explaining why. The synthesis problem is not that machines do ethics badly. It is that machines do something adjacent to ethics, something useful, perhaps essential, but not quite the same as human moral reasoning. They provide tools for ethical reflection. They do not replace the need for humans to make ethical judgments. The God-AI view is, ultimately, a mirror. It reflects back to humanity the principles we have articulated, the consequences we have produced, and the contradictions we have embodied. What we do with that reflection remains our choice. 5. The navigational synthesis, operating within the three mirrors. 5.1 Integration. How the mirrors function together. The three mirrors, Mind's AI, global collective voice, and God-AI view, are not separate systems. They are dimensions of a unified architecture for operating within the post-human horizon. The strategic core exists at the intersection of these three perspectives. The mind's AI ensures the individual human retains cognitive integrity, that their judgment remains independent even as it is informed by machine intelligence. This is the internal anchor, preventing cognitive dissolution and maintaining the capacity for genuinely autonomous thought. The global collective voice provides continuous feedback about collective human behavior and revealed preference. This is the societal anchor, ensuring that institutional decisions remain connected to observable human reality rather than abstract models or ideological commitments. The God-AI view enforces ethical boundaries derived from synthesized universal principles. This is the normative anchor, ensuring that optimization processes do not drift toward outcomes that violate fundamental human values. Together, these three mirrors create a navigational system for operating in an environment where certainty is impossible, where change is continuous, and where the relationship between action and outcome is increasingly opaque. The strategic core uses this system not to eliminate uncertainty, which cannot be eliminated, but to navigate it with maximum awareness of their own cognitive limitations, maximum connection to collective human reality, and maximum fidelity to ethical principles that transcend immediate institutional interest. 5.2 The Failure Modes. When the system breaks down. No system is failure-proof. The architecture of the three mirrors contains vulnerabilities that must be understood and actively managed. Failure Mode 1. Mirror Worship. The executive becomes psychologically dependent on machine-generated perspectives, unable to function without continuous access to all three mirrors. They experience paralysis when systems fail or when they must operate in environments where machine intelligence is unavailable. They have outsourced their judgment so completely that they no longer possess independent decision-making capacity. This failure mode is insidious because it appears superficially as successful integration with the system. The executive seems highly competent, making data-driven decisions, operating efficiently. But they have become a component of the machine system rather than its sovereign operator. Defense. Regular practice of decision-making under information scarcity. Deliberate exercises where the executive must make high-stakes decisions with minimal machine support, maintaining the cognitive muscles necessary for truly independent judgment. Failure Mode 2. Mirror Rejection. The executive, overwhelmed by the cognitive and psychological demands of the navigational stance, regresses to pre-posthuman decision-making. They ignore machine intelligence, dismiss collective behavioral data as manipulation, and treat ethical synthesis as abstract philosophy irrelevant to practical operation. This failure mode often follows a traumatic error, a decision where machine intelligence proved wrong, or where behavioral data misled, or where ethical constraints prevented an action that appeared optimal. The executive concludes that the entire system is unreliable and reverts to pure human intuition. This is catastrophic within the thin structure. An institution cannot operate at the speed and scale required for 2025 to 2035 survival using pre-posthuman decision-making. The executive, who rejects the mirrors, becomes a bottleneck, Reintroducing the decision latencies the existential bypass was designed to eliminate. Defense. Psychological support systems that help executives process the inevitable failures and errors without losing faith in the overall architecture. Recognition that machine intelligence enhances rather than replaces human judgment, and that errors are learning opportunities rather than system invalidation. Failure Mode 3. Mirror conflict. The three mirrors generate contradictory guidance. Individual intuition suggests one course of action, collective behavioral data suggests another, ethical synthesis flags both as problematic. The executive faces genuine incommensurability. No decision satisfies all three perspectives simultaneously. This is not a bug. It is a feature. The mirrors are designed to create productive tension, forcing explicit recognition of trade-offs rather than allowing them to remain implicit. But the tension can become paralyzing if the executive lacks the sovereign clarity necessary to make decisions despite unresolvable contradictions. Defense. Training in tragic decision-making. The acceptance that leadership often requires choosing between imperfect options, that some situations admit no right answer, and that the executive's function is not to find perfect solutions, but to choose decisively amongst flawed alternatives whilst acknowledging the costs. 5.3 The Temporal Dimension, Navigating Across Time Horizons. The posthuman horizon introduces a temporal complexity absent from traditional institutional leadership. Decisions must be evaluated across radically different timescales simultaneously. Machine systems operate on millisecond timescales for certain functions, high-frequency trading, real-time compliance verification, and on multi-decade timescales. For others, climate risk modeling, demographic projections. Collective human behavior exhibits patterns at daily, monthly, and generational scales. Ethical principles claim timeless validity but must be applied in specific temporal contexts. The strategic core must navigate across these scales simultaneously. A decision that appears optimal at the quarterly scale may be catastrophic at the decade scale. A strategy that serves collective revealed preference today may undermine the values humanity will need tomorrow. An action that violates ethical principles temporarily may be necessary to preserve the institution that upholds those principles long term. This is the temporal expression of the navigational stance, operating without the comfort of a single time horizon, holding multiple temporal perspectives simultaneously, and making decisions that attempt to serve institutional survival across all relevant scales. There is no algorithm for this. There is only judgment, informed by the three mirrors, but ultimately sovereign in its willingness to act despite temporal uncertainty. 5.4 The Question of Legitimacy. Who authorizes the augmented human? We must confront the legitimacy question directly. What gives the augmented human, this figure operating at the intersection of machine intelligence and human judgment, the authority to make decisions that affect thousands or millions of lives? Traditional sources of legitimacy are strained within the posthuman horizon. Democratic legitimacy assumes that decision-makers are accountable to populations through electoral mechanisms, but the augmented human's decisions often involve technical complexity and temporal scales that make meaningful democratic oversight impossible. Voters cannot evaluate decisions whose consequences will not manifest for decades and whose mechanisms they cannot understand. Expert legitimacy assumes that decision-makers possess specialized knowledge unavailable to laypeople, but the augmented human's expertise is not traditional domain knowledge. It is the capacity to integrate machine intelligence across domains, to navigate radical uncertainty, and to make judgment calls that no amount of data can fully support. This is not expertise in the conventional sense. Institutional legitimacy assumes that organizations operate within legal frameworks that constrain their action and provide recourse when they overstep. But the speed and complexity of posthuman institutional operation increasingly outpace regulatory frameworks. The augmented human often operates in legal gray zones where formal rules have not caught up to operational reality. None of these traditional sources suffice. The augmented human's legitimacy must rest on a fourth foundation: demonstrated navigational competence. This is legitimacy earned through consistently making decisions that preserve institutional survival whilst maintaining ethical boundaries, that respond to collective revealed preference whilst not becoming its slave, and that integrate machine intelligence whilst retaining sovereign judgment. It is legitimacy demonstrated rather than conferred, validated through outcomes rather than credentials or electoral victory. This is uncomfortable. It is less democratic than we might wish. It concentrates power in individuals selected for psychological and cognitive capacities that are difficult to define and impossible to certify through formal examination. It creates the conditions for elite capture and technocratic authoritarianism. But it may be the only form of legitimacy viable within the posthuman horizon. We cannot navigate radical uncertainty through committees. We cannot make decisions at machine speed through democratic deliberation. We cannot preserve ethical boundaries through market mechanisms. We can only cultivate individuals capable of operating within the three mirrors, provide them with the institutional architecture necessary to function, hold them accountable for outcomes, and remove them when they fail. This is not the governance structure we might have chosen, but it may be the structure that survival demands. 5.5. The succession problem. Reproducing the augmented human. Perhaps the most pressing operational question is how to reproduce the augmented human, how to cultivate the cognitive, psychological, and ethical capacities necessary for operating within the posthuman horizon. Traditional leadership development focuses on domain expertise, strategic thinking, and interpersonal skills. These remain necessary, but insufficient. The augmented human requires additional capacities that existing educational and professional development systems are not designed to cultivate. Cognitive flexibility, the ability to shift rapidly between different modes of thinking, analytical and intuitive, machine-mediated and direct, short-term and long-term, without becoming confused or paralyzed. Psychological resilience, the ability to maintain sovereign clarity under conditions of continuous uncertainty, information overload, and ethical ambiguity, without retreating into denial or decision paralysis. Epistemic humility, the discipline of recognizing the limits of one's knowledge whilst remaining willing to act decisively, and of updating beliefs rapidly in response to new evidence without defensive attachment to prior positions. Ethical integrity, the capacity to maintain boundaries under pressure, to resist optimization, nihilism even when competitors appear to benefit from it, and to articulate ethical reasoning transparently. Synthetic perception, the ability to integrate information from the three mirrors: individual cognition, collective behavior, ethical principles, into coherent operational judgment. These capacities cannot be taught through classroom instruction. They must be cultivated through experience in environments that demand them. This suggests a developmental pathway. Stage 1. Exposure to radical uncertainty, years 1 to 3. Junior professionals are placed in roles where they must make consequential decisions with incomplete information, where the environment changes faster than planning cycles, and where machine intelligence provides support but cannot dictate outcomes. They learn that certainty is impossible and develop comfort with ambiguity. Stage 2. Integration with machine systems, years 4 to 7. Mid-career professionals work extensively with the synthetic middle, learning to interpret machine-generated analysis, to recognize when machines are reliable and when they are extrapolating beyond their training data, and to integrate machine intelligence with independent judgment. Stage 3. Ethical crisis navigation, years 8 to 12. Senior professionals are exposed to situations where optimization creates ethical tension, where institutional interest conflicts with broader societal welfare, and where they must articulate and defend decisions that involve genuine ethical trade-offs. Stage 4. Strategic core preparation, years 13 plus. Candidates for strategic core positions operate in roles that require synthesis across all three mirrors simultaneously, make decisions with multi-decade consequences, and demonstrate navigational competence under observation. This pathway is longer and more demanding than traditional executive development. It produces fewer candidates, but it may be the only way to ensure institutional continuity in the post-human horizon, cultivating a cadre of individuals psychologically and cognitively capable of operating within the architecture we have built. The alternative, promoting based on conventional criteria and hoping individuals adapt, will produce catastrophic leadership failures as executives trained for stable environments attempt to navigate radical uncertainty without the necessary capacities. 5.6. The species. Question: what becomes of humanity? We conclude with the question implicit throughout this section. If institutions restructure around the augmented human operating within machine-mediated architecture, what becomes of the human species? This is not a question about job displacement, though that is significant. This is a question about human nature, human purpose, and human flourishing in an age when our primary interface with reality is synthetic. 3 scenarios merit consideration. Scenario 1. The Great Bifurcation. Humanity divides into 2 populations: a small elite of augmented humans operating within the strategic core of major institutions, possessing the cognitive and psychological capacities necessary for post-human operation, and a larger population increasingly disconnected from meaningful economic participation, sustained through automated systems but lacking the pathway to institutional influence or even comprehension of how institutions function. This scenario is dystopian not because of material deprivation — automated systems can provide material abundance — but because of meaning deprivation. The vast majority of humans would live in a world they do not understand, making decisions that feel consequential but are actually inconsequential. whilst the real decisions are made by an elite operating through machine systems they cannot access. This risks social instability, legitimacy collapse, and eventual violent reaction against the post-human architecture. It is potentially a stable equilibrium in the short term, but catastrophically unstable over decades. Scenario 2. The Cognitive Commons. Machine intelligence becomes genuinely democratized. The capacities that currently distinguish the augmented human, access to synthetic intelligence, the ability to navigate radical uncertainty, integration across the three mirrors, become available to large populations through improved interfaces, educational systems designed for the post-human condition, and institutional structures that distribute rather than concentrate cognitive enhancement. This scenario is optimistic, but faces significant obstacles. The capacities required for post-human operation may not be broadly distributable. They may require cognitive and psychological configurations that are rare in the population and cannot be trained at scale. If so, democratization efforts may produce the appearance of inclusion, whilst the actual power remains concentrated amongst those genuinely capable of post-human operation. Scenario 3. The Perpetual Transition. Humanity remains in continuous adaptation. Each generation develops new capacities in response to the changing technological environment. What appears post-human to us becomes normal to our children, who then face their own post-human challenges. There is no stable endpoint, no final configuration of human nature, only continuous evolution driven by our own technological creations. This scenario is neither optimistic nor pessimistic. It is realist. It suggests that the post-human horizon is not a destination, but a permanent condition. That humanity will be continuously remaking itself in response to the systems we build, and that the challenge is not to reach some stable configuration, but to ensure that each generation retains the capacity to navigate its own unique uncertainties. Of these three scenarios, the third appears most probable based on historical precedent. Humans have been remaking themselves technologically for millennia. Through writing, which transformed memory and reasoning, through printing, which transformed knowledge distribution, through industrialization, which transformed social organization. Each transformation felt post-human to those experiencing it. Each became simply human to the next generation. The post-human horizon may be simply the latest iteration of this process, distinguished from prior transformations primarily by its speed and scale, rather than by any fundamental difference in kind. 6. Sovereign clarity. The final position. 6.1. What we have built. We return to first principles. This paper has argued that institutions face an existential crisis arising from the convergence of demographic collapse, fiscal exhaustion, regulatory whiplash, and narrative instability. We have argued that survival requires radical restructuring, the existential bypass that collapses hierarchies, embeds critical functions within machine state architecture, and reduces traditional middle management by 40 to 60%. We have argued that this restructuring creates a new category of human, the augmented human, operating at the strategic core of the thin structure, making decisions through the integration of machine intelligence and human judgment. We have argued that this figure must navigate through three mirrors: the mind's AI, internal cognitive integrity, the global collective voice, collective human behavior, and the God AI view, synthesized ethical principles to maintain both institutional survival and adherence to fundamental human values. And we have acknowledged the profound uncertainties, the psychological costs, the ethical hazards, and the legitimacy questions this architecture creates. What we have built is not a solution. It is a navigational system for operating within permanent crisis. It does not eliminate uncertainty. It provides tools for acting despite uncertainty. It does not resolve ethical dilemmas. It makes them explicit and forces accountability for how they are resolved. This is the most we can achieve. There is no stable ground. There is no return to pre-crisis simplicity. There is only continuous navigation through an environment that will remain turbulent for the foreseeable future. 6.2. The choice before institutional leadership. Every institution operating at scale, multinational corporations, financial institutions, regulatory agencies, healthcare systems, faces a binary choice over the next 24 months. Choice A: execute the existential bypass, implement the thin structure, deploy the synthetic middle, reduce middle management by 40 to 60%, train or recruit augmented humans capable of operating within the three mirrors, accept the trauma, the psychological costs, and the legitimacy challenges, survive the 2025 to 2035 horizon. Choice B: preserve the existing hierarchy, maintain traditional organizational structure, continue human-driven compliance and decision-making, avoid the trauma of delayering, fail to adapt to regulatory whiplash, become obsolete within the decade. There is no choice C. There is no phase transition that preserves headcount whilst achieving necessary speed. There is no hybrid model that maintains layers of middle management whilst collapsing decision latency. The mathematics of information flow and decision speed are unforgiving. The institutions that execute choice A will define the next decade. They will capture market position, regulatory favor, and operational capacity that their competitors cannot match. They will operate in a different temporal frame, adapting to changes whilst others are still processing them. The institutions that default to choice B, either through explicit decision or through paralysis, will be studied as case examples of organizational failure. Their collapse will be analyzed in business schools and policy institutes as cautionary tales about the consequences of institutional rigidity in environments of radical change. This is not hyperbole. This is arithmetic. The decision latency of traditional hierarchies cannot match the speed of regulatory change and market evolution. The institutions that cannot adapt will not survive. It is that simple. It is that brutal. 6.3. The personal cost. What we ask of leaders. We must be honest about what we are asking of the individuals who will operate within this system. We are asking them to maintain cognitive integrity whilst immersed in machine-mediated perception. We are asking them to make decisions of existential consequence based on evidence they cannot fully verify. We are asking them to navigate ethical dilemmas where no choice is clean, where every option involves sacrifice, and where they will be held accountable regardless of outcome. We are asking them to operate in a state of permanent uncertainty without the psychological comfort of stable ground or clear rules. We are asking them to lead institutions through a decade of continuous crisis whilst maintaining the ethical boundaries that prevent optimization nihilism. We are asking them to accept existential isolation, to operate in a cognitive space that their peers cannot fully understand, making decisions they cannot fully explain, carrying responsibility they cannot fully share. This is not a role that can be performed indefinitely. The psychological strain will accumulate. The cognitive demands will exact a toll. We will need mechanisms for rotation, for recovery, for supporting individuals who carry these burdens. And we will need to recognize that some percentage of those who attempt this role will fail, not through incompetence, but through the inherent difficulty of what we are asking. They will experience cognitive dissolution, or mirror worship, or decision paralysis. They will need to be identified and removed before their failures cascade into institutional catastrophe. This is the human cost of institutional survival in the post-human horizon. We have no right to minimize it. We have no right to pretend it is easy or natural or anything other than genuinely difficult. All we can do is acknowledge it honestly and ensure that those who bear it receive the support, recognition, and eventual relief they deserve. 6.4. The civilizational stakes. Beyond individual institutions. The restructuring we have described is not confined to individual institutions. It is occurring in various forms and at various speeds across every developed economy. The question is not whether this transformation will occur, but whether it will be managed deliberately or allowed to unfold chaotically. If managed deliberately, with attention to the psychological costs, the ethical boundaries, and the legitimacy questions, the transformation can produce institutions genuinely capable of navigating the 2025 to 2035 horizon whilst preserving core human values. If allowed to unfold chaotically, driven purely by competitive pressure with no attention to human costs or ethical constraints, the transformation will produce institutions that survive, but that have sacrificed their legitimacy, their ethical grounding, and their connection to collective human welfare. The difference is not academic. Institutions that lose legitimacy become targets for political intervention, social resistance, and eventual collapse. Institutions that violate ethical boundaries create systemic risks that propagate through the broader economy. Institutions that disconnect from collective human welfare become engines of social instability, even as they achieve short-term efficiency gains. The stakes are civilizational. We are not merely restructuring companies or agencies. We are restructuring the fundamental architecture of how human societies organize collective action in an age of machine intelligence. If we do this well, we can navigate the turbulence ahead whilst preserving democratic governance, market economies, and individual liberty. If we do this badly, we risk creating technocratic oligarchies, systemic fragility, and social explosions that make the populist revolts of the 2000s and 10s appear mild. This is not exaggeration. This is sober assessment of what is at stake when we restructure institutions that collectively govern trillions in assets, affect billions of lives, and determine the trajectory of human civilization through the most turbulent decade of the 21st century. 6.5. The path forward. Sovereign clarity. We conclude not with hope, which would be false comfort, but with clarity. The path is difficult. The costs are real. The uncertainties are irreducible. The risks are substantial. Success is not guaranteed, and even successful navigation will involve continuous adaptation, repeated failures, and ongoing ethical compromises. But the path exists. The navigational tools are available. The architecture can be built. Institutions that execute the existential bypass with psychological awareness, ethical integrity, and legitimate authority can survive the 2025 to 2035 horizon. Those that do so will not have solved the crisis. They will have navigated it successfully enough to reach whatever landscape emerges on the far side. They will have preserved institutional capacity, maintained ethical boundaries, and demonstrated that human judgment can operate effectively even when mediated through synthetic intelligence. This is sovereign clarity, the cold-eyed recognition that survival is possible but difficult, that there are no clean victories, and that the price of continuation is continuous vigilance, psychological resilience, and ethical discipline. We know what must be done. We know the costs. We know the risks. What remains is the choice: to attempt the navigation, accepting all that it demands, or to preserve familiar structures and accept obsolescence. The horizon approaches. The institutions that navigate successfully will define the next era of human organization. The institutions that fail will serve as markers of where others stumbled. There is clarity in this, if not comfort. The map has been drawn. The route has been charted. What remains is the will to traverse it. Concluding note. This paper has provided the architectural blueprint for institutional survival across the 2025 to 2035 horizon. It has diagnosed the crisis, prescribed the restructuring, and examined the human implications of operating within post-human institutional architecture. What it has not provided, deliberately, is false comfort. The path ahead is genuinely difficult. The transformation will be genuinely traumatic. The uncertainties are genuinely irreducible, but the navigation is genuinely possible for those with the will to attempt it and the wisdom to acknowledge its costs. The horizon approaches. The choice remains. Navigare necesse est.